It was once prophesied that crowns and not needles were her destiny. She was the Tudor queen who, as the rhyme goes, survived. She was also the woman who elected to marry her king, unselfishly choosing duty over love.
He lived his whole life in the shadow of his elder brother. The rivalry between the two, fueled by jealousy and ambition, ultimately would be his downfall.
This is a story of Katherine Parr and Thomas Seymour, told from their final home together here at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide.
And I'm Phil from the Tudor Tours. Together, we're going to give you a brief insight into their story.
Katherine Parr is best known as the sixth wife of Henry VIII. However, she was a remarkable woman in her own right. Learned, a devout follower of the newly emerging Reformed faith, and generous in spirit.
After an eventful life, which saw Katherine married 4 times, held hostage during the Pilgrimage of Grace, raised to the level of queenship and then nearly thrown into the Tower for treason, she died here at Sudeley Castle at the age of 36.
Thomas Seymour. Womaniser, ambitious, hot-headed and greedy. Although those statements hold some truth, if we just dig a little deeper, you may see a side to Thomas that you didn't expect. Over the years, Thomas's character has somewhat succumbed to name-calling. Yes, he may have enjoyed some pleasures whilst at court in England and abroad, but he had no known mistresses or any claims of illegitimate children.
Katherine was married for the first time aged 17 and a widow by 22. She would shortly marry again, this time an older man, John Neville, Lord Latimer of Snape Castle in North Yorkshire. Their marriage was to last 9 years, but by the winter of 1542, John Neville was clearly dying, and Katherine spent much of that winter caring for her husband at their Charterhouse home in London. In March the following year, John Neville died and was shortly thereafter buried at St Paul's Cathedral.
Thomas Seymour was the youngest surviving son of John Seymour, brother to Henry VIII's third wife Jane and uncle to the young Prince Edward. When he was younger, he received a good education but didn't show promise like his elder brother Edward. Instead, he went into the service of Sir Francis Bryan in 1530. Thomas thrived action and particularly enjoyed being at sea. Of course, Henry's marriage to his sister Jane and the birth of Prince Edward in 1537 increases the Seymours' position. Soon after the prince was born, Thomas was knighted and granted lands from the dissolved monasteries of Essex, Hampshire and Berkshire, whereas his brother was given a grand title of the Earl of Hertford.
By now, Katherine was an experienced 30-year-old woman of the world, and although long past the first flush of youth by Tudor standards, paintings of Katherine reveal her slim figure, dark eyes and lustrous hair, which her biographer, Linda Porter, describes as being the colour of burnished gold.
Descriptions written at the time paint a picture of an attractive woman.
Katherine was said to be of a lively and pleasing appearance, endowed with rare gifts of nature, surely something that any gentleman would find appealing. Her singular beauty and other accomplishments were clearly attractive to the ageing King Henry VIII, who, in the spring of 1543, was approaching his 52nd birthday. However, it was most certainly not the king who Katherine initially had in mind as her potential suitor.
For she had fallen in love with one of the most desirable and attractive men at court, Thomas Seymour.
Seymour was actually well liked by his peers. He was the most eligible bachelor at court. In his 30s and not yet married, he was tall, well-built, charismatic and handsome. Not only that, he was a member of one of the most powerful families in England. With this in mind, it's understandable that Katherine, who was of similar age and standing, found him appealing. In January 1543, Thomas was back in London, and a few months later he could pay court to Katherine. He flirted with Katherine, and it's clear that he had feelings for her. We don't know how the couple met, but the likelihood is through her brother, William Parr. Nothing suggests that Thomas had asked her to be his mistress when she was still married to Latimer. Just when Thomas thought he had the woman he wanted, another suitor made himself known. The King.
It seems that soon after her second husband had been laid to rest, Katherine found herself in a quandary. While her heart lay with Seymour, the king had proposed to Lady Latimer, probably in the April of 1543. It is only from the letters written to Thomas Seymour after Henry VIII's death do we gain an insight into Katherine's intense inner struggle between heart and mind during this brief window in time.
God withstood my will therein most vehemently for a time, and through his grace and goodness made that possible which seemeth to me most impossible, that was, made me to renounce utterly mine own will, and to follow his will most willingly, as truly as God is God, that my mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty, to marry you before any man I know.
Surprisingly, Thomas, a man that was known to show his emotion, backed down. He may have thought to himself, now the king was 52 years of age and with deteriorating health, this marriage was not going to be a long one. And on the death of the king, Katherine would retain her royal status. He's just going to have to sit and wait it out. The Imperial Ambassador on the 10th of March noted that Thomas was sent back to the Netherlands as Henry's representative. Seymour was now out of the way.
At some point during the summer months, Katherine's mind was made up. And after only 4 months of being widowed for the second time, at the age of 30, she was married to Henry VIII of England on the 12th of July 1543 in the Queen's Closet at Hampton Court Palace. After a stellar bit of social climbing, Katherine was Queen of England.
During the latter part of Henry's reign, Thomas's newfound military expertise were rewarded with Master of Ordnance for life and an Admiral in Henry's navy. However, Henry had very little faith in his abilities, unlike those of his elder brother Edward, who was becoming more favoured by the king.
As 1546 drew to a close, it was clear to everyone that the king's health was failing. Separated from and not allowed to visit her husband, it is unclear exactly when and how Katherine found out about the king's death. Katherine was a widow for the 3rd time and her life was about to be turned upside down. However, before then, she would find out that the king's will had left her well provided for. Henceforth, she would always be attended as queen. She would live in luxury, served by a larger household, and would be free to make her own decisions. But if Katherine thought that she would remain at the centre of power as regent for her young stepson Edward VI, then she was to be bitterly disappointed.
On the death of the king and against Henry's wishes, Edward Seymour made himself Lord Protector and the Duke of Somerset. Thomas was made Baron Seymour of Sudeley and Lord High Admiral. Yet he was still not seen as one of the leading men in Edward's life. As the king's uncle, he felt the position of protector and governor should be shared. Tensions were high between the brothers, and Thomas really felt he drew the short straw when it came to Henry's will. Henry's will gave instruction for a government to rule during Edward's minority, consisting of 16 privy councillors and 10 assistant councillors, one of which was Thomas. Thomas first had ideas of marrying the Princess Elizabeth or possibly Mary. However, this would have had to have been agreed by the Privy Council, and not surprisingly was rejected. Thomas found himself rekindling an old flame with Katherine.
Katherine moved out of the royal palaces which she had come to know as home over the previous 4 years, and dived headlong into a passionate relationship with the man she was clearly deeply attracted to.
Both wanted power, and both were being frustrated by Thomas's elder brother Edward, head of the Privy Council. Perhaps they believed that through their strategic union they could exert more influence on the young boy king and the Privy Council than through their singular efforts alone.
However, that would have been easier said than done, as Edward Seymour's authority somewhat increased. On March the 12th, it was declared that he could bypass the advice of the Privy Council if he saw fit. It was clear now that Edward Seymour had full control over the young king, something which would have had Henry turning in his grave.
From her dower property at Chelsea, Katherine wrote regularly to Thomas, and he visited her often on late-night trysts. However, their surviving letters still tell us today that discretion remained of utmost importance.
I suppose. Ye may come without suspect. I pray you let me have knowledge overnight, to what hour ye will come, that your portress may wait at the gate to the fields for you.
Although no one knows the exact date of Katherine Parr's marriage to Thomas, it most likely took place in the last 2 weeks of May 1547. Thereafter, Katherine seems to have divided her time between her dower properties at Chelsea and Hanworth, with time spent at Seymour Place with Thomas and his ward, Lady Jane Grey.
Rumours soon spread of the marriage. The news, it seems, was by and large met with distaste. However, regardless of how people felt about the news, the die was cast, and 6 to 7 months into their marriage, Katherine found out she was pregnant.
When the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth was living with the couple, Thomas got hold of the key to her bedchamber. He would creep in the early morning, often bare-legged. He would tickle the princess and slap her bum. Sometimes Elizabeth would go along with it. Other times she'd be ready before Thomas arrived. Elizabeth's governess Kat Ashley knew exactly what Thomas was doing, and when she confronted him, he said he would not stop, for he meant no evil. On one occasion, Katherine went along with one of Thomas's games, holding the princess while he cut her gown into 100 pieces. However, these regular liaisons got all too much for Katherine, and she sent Elizabeth away. Today we would see this as absolutely shocking and sordid behaviour, but by Tudor standards, Elizabeth was a young woman of marriageable age.
Despite their ongoing struggles with the Protector, his wife and the Privy Council, it seems at least temporarily the couple had decided to focus their efforts on providing Katherine a safe and comfortable place in which she could see out the remainder of her pregnancy and deliver Thomas, his son and heir, away from the prying eyes and the pressures of court.
Thomas was convinced the child was going to be a boy, and he wanted the birth to be befitting for a queen, and what better place than his seat here at Sudeley Castle. When Seymour acquired Sudeley in February 1547, it was a little run down, so he enlisted the help of his friend Sir William Sharrington to make renovations costing a little over £1,000, somewhere in the region of a staggering £340,000 in today's money.
Sudeley, with its honey-coloured Cotswold stone, its fine privy range, pretty gardens and idyllic countryside, must have felt like a haven to Katherine after the tumultuous events of the previous year.
Letters survive to this time, and against popular belief, Thomas is very respectful towards Katherine, and his excitement about the new arrival is evident.
I do desire, your highness, to keep the little knave so lean and gaunt with your good diet and walking, that he may be so small that he creep out of a mouse hole. And I bid you, my most dear and well-beloved wife, most heartily well to fare.
However, all this lovingness was at times offset by bouts of jealousy and mood swings.
The privy lodgings, which would have housed Katherine and Thomas when they came here to Sudeley, had been developed by Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III, after he had taken ownership of the castle in the 1460s. When the couple arrived here in 1548, it would have been a splendid lodging range and surely fit for a queen. The range of privy lodgings here at Sudeley consisted of 6 or possibly 7 principal chambers, 3 on the ground floor and then 3 on the first floor, including a glorious presence chamber with its high vaulted oriel windows. There were also probably additional privy chambers, including Katherine's bedchamber, in a residential tower block which mirrors that of the surviving tower at the end of the West Range.
It is in this range of lodgings that Katherine would have whiled away her days, reading religious texts or writing letters alongside her ladies, including her sister Anne Herbert and the young Lady Jane Grey. She set about preparing a nursery for the new arrival, decorating it in colours of crimson and gold, and assiduously following the advice of her physician, Dr. Hickey, taking regular exercise by walking in the castle's beautiful grounds.
Although Katherine had endured an uncomfortable pregnancy, on the 30th of August the waiting was finally over. Katherine was delivered of a baby girl, who the couple named Mary in honour of Katherine's eldest stepdaughter. All seemed well initially, but then by the 31st of August, Katherine had begun to show the first signs of the dreaded puerperal fever, a bacterial infection which causes sepsis and widespread multi-organ failure. In a pre-antibiotic age, there was little hope. Katherine suffered bouts of delirium, and during one such bout, one of her ladies-in-waiting recorded how she had accused her husband of mocking her demise.
My Lady Tyrwhitt, I am not well handled, for those that be about me careth not for me, but standeth laughing at my grief. And the more good I do unto them, the less good they do unto me.
Damning words indeed. But we should remember that Katherine was in the grip of delirium when she accused her husband so, and that the lady-in-waiting, Lady Elizabeth Tyrwhitt, was no friend of Sir Thomas's, and so we will perhaps never know the truth of those words, and if indeed Katherine was aware of the accusations that she was making about her husband.
Despite those damning words about Thomas, it must be said that he remained with Katherine throughout. Tyrwhitt noted that he held her hand and even lay on the bed with her to help calm her, and he succeeded.
By the 3rd of September, Katherine was calm, but she surely knew death was approaching, for she summoned her physician, Dr. Hickey, and John Parkhurst, who had been her chaplain since she had been queen. She dictated her will, and she left all her goods to her husband to dispose of as he pleased. And then at some point, on the 5th of September, close to this very spot, Katherine finally slipped away.
Thomas understandably was shocked by Katherine's death. He ordered a fine funeral to take place. However, the heartbroken Thomas, clearly mourning his wife and full of grief, didn't attend.
Katherine's body was wrapped in cerecloth to embalm it, and then she was brought here to be buried on the north side of the high altar of the chapel at Sudeley. The funeral reflected Katherine's ardently held beliefs in the Reformed faith. It was short and in English, and was remarkable in its time and thought to be the first Protestant burial of an English queen.
Chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, who must have led the solemn procession from the Queen's privy chambers, across the bridge that spanned the moat and into the medieval chapel.
The weeks and months that followed, Thomas's hot-headedness continued. He was to break up Katherine's household and send Jane Grey home. But they went back on that decision, and his intentions were now back with the Princess Elizabeth. On the 16th of January 1549, Thomas allegedly attempted to break into the king's apartment to kidnap him. The alarm was raised when one of the king's dogs barked, but when the guards came rushing in, all they found was a lifeless dog that had been killed. One report said this pointed to the Admiral because he had scattered the watch that evening on several errands. Unfortunately, with any actual hard evidence, it's difficult to know what happened that night. Was he framed or was he guilty? Either way, Thomas was found guilty on 33 counts of treason by Act of Attainder on the 5th of March. 15 days later, he was executed on Tower Hill. It took 2 strokes of the axe.
When Katherine died at the age of 36, she had lived an extraordinary life. But if her life was remarkable, then what happened to her after death was truly shocking.
Nearly 100 years after Katherine Parr's death, Sudeley Castle was slighted by parliamentarian forces and subsequently abandoned for around 200 years. The once beautiful castle began to crumble, and ivy grew around the ruins. The chapel also fell into disrepair, and Katherine's tomb, sadly, was largely forgotten. Around 200 years later, in 1782, a group of lady sightseers arrived for a day trip. Determined to examine the ruins of the chapel, finding a block of alabaster fixed into the derelict wall of the chapel. They enlisted help to dig below the panel and discovered a lead coffin, buried not a foot beneath the ground. Driven by curiosity, they made 2 openings in the leaden envelope, one over the face and one over the breast, and were shocked to discover that the Queen's face was in the most perfect state of preservation. In the same summer, the coffin was opened again, and an incision was made in the layers of cerecloth covering the former Queen's arm. Her flesh was noted to still be moist and white.
Katherine's body remained undisturbed for a further 2 years, until the spring of 1784, when a group of ruffians unearthed the body and brutally violated it, casting it upon a rubbish heap. However, we're lucky, for one eyewitness was able to recount how Katherine was dressed in costly burial clothes with shoes upon her feet, that all her limbs were delicately proportioned, and that there were still vestiges of beauty upon her face. 2 years later, in 1786, Katherine's body was exhumed for one final time. This time it was for a formal autopsy. Now, by this stage, the body was in an advanced state of decay. However, measurements of her coffin was able to tell us one more thing about this long-dead Tudor queen, and that was that during life, Katherine Parr stood 5'3" tall.
Eventually, Catherine's remains, which were now little more than brown dust, were reinterred in a stone vault of the Chandos Chapel. This chapel was restored and rededicated in 1863. Part of this restoration included a design for a magnificent canopied tomb with a recumbent effigy of the Queen, fashioned from white marble, which can still be seen here at Sudeley today. Finally, Katherine could rest in peace.
And so ends our Tudor tale of passion and romance.
And although thwarted from gaining power and status that perhaps they believed was their right, for a few brief moments in the summer of 1548, we might imagine Katherine and Thomas able to delight in each other's company, away from the intrigues of court and surrounded by the tranquil charms of Sudeley Castle.
I'm Sarah and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide, and you can find out more about Phil at his Tudor Tours Facebook page.
And you can follow Sarah on her Tudor adventure via her Tudor Travel Guide blog at thetudortravelguide.com.